I'm going to introduce our first lecturer, Simon Ford. Is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for the Study of Christianity at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and a Semitic language research assistant on the Manar al-Attar project at the University of Oxford. He completed an M. Philosophy in Byzantine Studies and D. Philosophy and History at the University of Oxford, as well as BA in History and Classical Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and has served as a Junior Research Fellow at the Research Center of Anatolian Civilization of our University in Istanbul. Okay, Dr. Simon Ford.
Thank you very much. I should apologize in advance, mostly to the panel's respondent, but also to the audience. This paper is not what it says on the tin. It is part of an ongoing and really very inchoate project looking for fragmentary evidence of rigorism within the anti-Chalcedonian Church between 518 and roughly 638. But for the purposes of this paper, I'm going to focus specifically on a set of rigorous sects which emerged in the first 2 decades, roughly, of the 6th century. In the first half of the paper, I'll lay out the catalog of sects. And in the second half of the paper, I'm going to do something which I think is probably methodologically unsound, but might be entertaining, and attempt to reconstruct at least part of the justification for rigorism given by one of these sects. Right. At the beginning of the 6th century, the anti-Chalcedonian movement in the patriarchal dioceses of Antioch, Constantinople, and Alexandria was divided to various degrees over the question of how to receive converts who had previously communicated with the Council of Chalcedon, with the election of the staunchly anti-rigorist Severus to the patriarchal throne of Antioch on the 16th of November, 512. The actual day is not important, but 512. The normative position of the church, which it was subsequently carried into exile after 518 to 522, came to be aligned explicitly with the earlier determinations of Timothy II of Alexandria, the successor to Dioscorus and leader of the anti-Chalcedonian faction in the city between 457 and 477. Timothy had received converts from the pro-Chalcedonian faction under Proturius without the imposition of baptism, ordination, or chrismation, but simply upon the completion of a written repudiation and anathema of their former heresy and following a period of penance. This model, however, lenient and in many senses pragmatic, was nonetheless constituted to some members of the anti-Chalcedonian community an implicit and effective recognition of the sacramental capacity of Chalcedon and its adherents, at least with respect to the performance of the central rites of ordination and baptism. Nonetheless, let's see, which stood in tension with the more rigid views of the efficacy of heretical sacraments then current within the larger anti-Chalcedonian movement. Notably, these views were expressed most normatively around the question of the Eucharist. The Eucharist of the Chalcedonians, like the Eucharist of all heretics, is in fact poison, so say, well, most Chalcedonian or anti-Chalcedonian authors. This was expressed in a variety of ways, from what might be regarded as a blatant rigorism to a set of more acutely expressed rigorous views held by a number of dissenting sects, which emerged towards the end of the 5th and the beginning of the 6th century, representing the radical fringe of the anti-Chalcedonian in Orient and Anatolia. These sects were frequently, though by no means exclusively, associated with the phenomenon of pseudo-episcopacy, that is, the assumption by a member of the laity or lower clergy of the absent ordination of the dignity and duties of the episcopate. All but endemic to the movement these self-declared bishops appear to have flourished in the institutional vacuums created by the periodic suppression of the actual anti-Chalcedonian episcopate during the late 5th and early 6th centuries, coming to a particular head after the coming to a particular head of the persecutions of Justin I in 518 to 522, when these bishops began to compete directly for legitimacy and support among the recently leaderless anti-Chalcedonian communities of the region with the then deposed bishops. During this time, details regarding the internal organization and sacramental discourse of these sects is limited. However, it seems not unlikely, given the persistence and proliferation of rigorous sentiments throughout the period, as well as the number of schismatic groups which adopted them, that their adoption of a hardline position on the sacramental validity of pro-Chalcedonian rites constituted at least part of their appeal. The sort of archetypal group for this set of rigorists are theoretically the followers of Theodotus of Jaffa, sometimes called the Reanointers, or more elaborately, the Anachristo Novatians, because more terms is more fun. Among the members of the Palestinian episcopate, ordained by the usurper Patriarch Theodosius of Jerusalem, who occupied the see during the absence of Jovenal between 451 and 453, Theodotus became the focus of a rigorous faction of anti-Chalcedonian exiles in Egypt, following the restoration of Timothy II in 475. Although comparatively little is known about the subsequent history of the sect during the late 5th century, they are nonetheless treated as a contemporary problem by Severus in letters written between 519, well, really between 512 and 538, at which time they continued to actively advocate for the reception of Chalcedonian converts the reconsecration of Chalcedonian converts, and appear to have been particularly active in the area of Alexandria. In contemporary correspondence, the patriarch Severus refers to the group as the Reanointers, whereas later chroniclers, following Pseudo-Zachariah, refer to the sect exclusively and somewhat elaborately as the Anachristo Novatians, in reference to the 3rd century rigorous sect of the Novatians. The extent, however, to which either of the available sources, or any of the available sources rather, may be regarded as describing a unitary movement with definite confessional boundaries and a common institutional and theological identity is profoundly unclear, based on the available evidence. Certainly the uniform prominence given to Theodotus by anti-rigorous sources as the focus for the rigorous opposition to Timothy II in the 470s, as well as his subsequent invocation as a sort of rigorous heresiarch, give the appearance of a common identity for the movement. Nevertheless, there is no certain evidence to suggest, let alone to demonstrate, that such an identity was in fact internal to the movement. While there is at least a certain amount of evidence to suggest that believers, or rigorists, felt able to pick and choose amongst the teachings of Theodotus as they were transmitted. Notably in a letter, which will be discussed later in the paper, by Severus, the Patriarch accuses at least one group of rigorists of having purposely omitted the heretical leanings of Theodotus, who towards the end of his career had fallen under the sway of a extreme Theopascite named John the Raider, who posited that Christ was the Word crucified, but not united with, in essence, with man. Moreover, the extent to which a movement which was ultimately acapholytic and without a stable autonomous clergy was able to reliably articulate and promulgate a single confessional orthodoxy is likewise doubtful. Rather, the term followers of Theodotus is probably best thought of as seems likely to be best thought of as an umbrella term given to rigorous sects rather than a designate of a specific coherent movement. At least one of these rigorous sects emerged around the figure of the pseudo-bishop Gregory, who appears in a letter written shortly after the exile of Severus of Antioch in 518. That I haven't said this already is criminal, but Severus of Antioch is more or less our main source for all of these. A native of Pontus, Gregory is said to have been circulating among the anti-Chalcedonian communities in and around Antioch, where he fraudulently claimed to be the bishop of Dio Caesarea in Cappadocia, Secunda, who had been forced from his bishopric for his refusal to subscribe to the libellus Formistus, presumably shortly after 518. In another letter, Severus refers to Gregory as a follower of Theodotus of Jopp. This statement, however, should be interpreted as evidence that the pseudo-bishop and his sect, which should not be interpreted as evidence that the pseudo-bishop and his sect were a literal offshoot of the earlier Anachristo Novatians, but perhaps rather that Severus wished to signal that Gregory, like Theodotus, had adopted a more or less rigorous policy towards the reception of Chalcedonian clergy. The sources around Gregory, unfortunately, are more concerned with his illegal ordination than with his rigorism as such, so that it is not possible to go much beyond this. Further groups emerged at the same time, however, perhaps the most prolific of which are the Zebabites and the Zacchites. The former, more durable and better documented than most, formed around the eponymous pseudo-bishop, who seems to have flourished at some point between 512 and 535, and to have persisted as a concern for Severan Jacobite legislators until at least 538-542. Although the available sources provide only a perfunctory reference to the beliefs of the sect, whose odiousness lay principally in the irregularity of its episcopate, they are nonetheless consistent in describing them as having demanded the rebaptism and reordination of Chalcedonian converts, which sets them apart from the earlier rigorous like Theodotus of Jaffa, who had merely demanded the chrismation of converts. The Zacchites, although comparatively poorly attested, appear in Michael the Syrian to have sprung up around Edessa, skipping ahead a bit, and to have again demanded the rebaptism and reordination of Chalcedonian converts, following much the same line as the Zebites, or Zebites, Zebidites. Sorry. It is the unfortunate reality of the sources that, with the sole exception of the reanointers described by Severus in a series of letters written between 513 and roughly 527, none of the specific theology of none of these sects can be recovered with any accuracy. Here, and with the reanointers, we are reliant entirely upon 3 letters written by Severus himself. The most significant of which was an extended epistolary treatise preserved in the manuscript tradition under the altogether prosaic title "Against Those Who Say That Men Who Have Communicated with the Synod of Chalcedon and are impenitent and anathematize those who call our Lord and God Jesus Christ, 2 natures after the ineffable union, and come to the Orthodox faith, must be reanointed." According to the reference in a subsequent letter, to two Carian archimandrites, Photius and Andrew, this treatise was written sometime shortly after his ascension to the throne in 512, in response to a pamphlet being circulated by the rigorous community in Antioch. Severus drafted the treatise as a refutation to a series of what he regarded as its key propositions. It would, of course, be naive to suppose that the document constitutes a direct or uncomplicated witness to the propositions which it purports to refute. Certainly it is unlikely that, well, certainly Severus did not seek to provide an accurate transcription of these arguments. Rather, the document as a whole reads as more a rhetorical set piece in which the positions of his supposed interlocutors constitute little more than straw men. Nonetheless, the treatise does set out a series of claims about the sect, which, though not independently verifiable, appear distinct from the patriarch's larger rhetorical purpose in the treatise, and thus more likely to reflect a genuine reality. Despite devoting the most significant of these concerns, the justification for rigorism itself, despite devoting much of the work to an argument for the supersession of the earlier rigorous canons by more recent statutes, here a specific argument against the contemporary validity of the canons requiring the rebaptism of all heretics regardless of their sect, which had been promulgated by Cyprian of Carthage and the Synod of 256. Severus, nonetheless, reproves his interlocutors for having followed the innovation of Theodotus, mandating that converts from the council be perfected through chrismation rather than rebaptism or reordination, as a condition of their reception into the church. In a passage which borders on the openly ironic, Severus chides his rigorist opponents, saying, if you think Theodotus a strict practitioner because he recently introduced chrism in the case of the heresy of the Diophysites, know clearly that others, also among those who were zealous against the heresy, were afflicted with a madness that surpassed his strictness. For instance, Cassian, a disciple of Father Romanos, who is among the saints, who after an approved fashion was distinguished in Palestine for an ascetic life and an excellence at that time in tens of thousands of spiritual gifts of the Spirit, caused many disciples to secede. And he betook himself to Scythopolis and used audaciously and illegally to baptize converts from Chalcedon. About the same time, Theodotus, who went through tens of thousands of changes and contradicted himself, and is led in different directions at different times, like the teachers of the adverse party, was led in tens of thousands of directions, like the teachers of the adverse party. He then promises to pass over the rest in silence, which is a bit unfortunate. Although Severus does not explicitly link the propositions in his refutation to the justification offered by his rigorous interlocutors, for this stipulation appears to be reflected to a specific justification offered by his interlocutors. This stipulation appears to be reflected in a subsequent section of the treatise. In this latter passage, the Patriarch addresses the objection that the bishops assembled at Laodicea, or the synod which is called Laodicea in the text, had branded those who cleaved Emmanuel in two natures Paulists, or Paulianists. An assertion that he rejects is facile, since it ignores the convention by which heresies were routinely called according to their perceived proximity to earlier heretical traditions. Thus, he points out, Arians were called idolaters, and the Sabellianists were called Jews. This does not mean that either of those sects were received as pagans or as Jews. As noted already by E.W. Brooks, in the notes accompanying his translation of the text, Severus referred or the synod referred to in the text as Laodicea, is in fact the Council of Second Ephesus, which provides this slightly more clarity. The statutory principle at issue, however, here would seem to be most obviously derived from Canon 19 of the Council of Nicaea, which had required the rebaptism and reordination of the followers of the 3rd century heretic Paul of Samosata, on the grounds that the rite which they conducted had not been carried out in the name of the Trinity. The apparent implication being made by the petitioners to which Severus is responding had been to conceptualize Chalcedon either as a branch or as an expression of the Paulianist heresy, and thus to rationalize or construct their practice around Canon 19. Elsewhere, in a near contemporary letter addressed to the occupants of a monastery in Tagus, located by Thomas Carlson in eastern Assyria, on what grounds I am not precisely sure, Severus appears to refer to the contents of the treaty again. In warning the inmates of the convent against an overly scrupulous approach to the diptychs, the Patriarch likens their excessive punctiliousness to the rigorism of Theodotus and his sect. Here, he goes on to adduce the example of the repudiation tract produced against an unnamed rigorist faction in Antioch, presumably the one discussed above, which had argued that rebaptism of Chalcedonian converts was necessary for their reception into the church, again on the grounds of the pronouncements made at Second Ephesus, again referred to as Laodicea, as well as the letter of Julius I of Rome to Dionysius of Alexandria, which concerns the Paulianist heresy and its reception. Notwithstanding what is perhaps an errant reference to rebaptism, the letter appears to refer to the same anocharismatic sect and to suggest a larger intellectual context for its claims, or at least a larger patristic patrimony for its claims. A subsequent letter, and the final piece of evidence for this particular sect, composed between 521 and 527, and addressed to the exiled bishops Jonatella Philoxenus of Dulce, Dolichia, and Thomas of Dara, Severus again summarizes his treatise against the sect, suggesting that in an unthinking fervor they had supposed that these, that is Chalcedonian converts, ought to be perfected by chrism, just as the custom is for the Arians and the fighters against the Spirit. The statement does not precisely align with either the text as preserved in the corpus of Severus's extant correspondence, or to any other summary of the text, but seems to suggest that in addition to conceptualizing the act of rechrisimation, or reception through rechrisimation, as an extension of Canon 19 of Nicaea, his interlocutors might have also relied on Canon 7 of the Council of Constantinople, which had prescribed the anointing of Arians, Macedonians, Sabatians, and Novatian converts in order to support their doctrine of chrismation. Such a reading, however, does to a certain extent risk trespassing upon the limits of the available evidence, as the letter written to the bishops was composed roughly a decade after the original treatise and may well simply reflect a back projection on the part of Severus himself. Right. So what have I accomplished in my 28 minutes? I'm not entirely sure is the answer. And I'm happy for feedback, but the project as it stands, is interested in eliciting the diversity of anti-Chalcedonian expression during this period, and moving away from a more monolithic picture of the community as deriving its beliefs directly from Severus and Philoxenus, What I think the evidence suggests plainly, and I will move very quickly to step down, is that beneath the surface of a relatively limited nomenclature existed a vast plurality of opinions on and movements which opposed the immediate reception of Chalcedonian converts on both theological and pragmatic grounds. But if anyone else has a better reading, I'm happy to hear it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the time. So I'm going to introduce
So I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Eitan Ginzberg is a retired lecturer of history and culture at the Kibbutzim College of Education and a researcher at the Sverdlin Institute of Latin American History and Culture at the University of Tel Aviv. His research focuses on the history and culture of Mexico and Latin America and the study of genocide. Dr. Ginzberg is author of Lázaro Cárdenas, Gobernador de Michoacán, Revolutionary Ideology and Political Destiny in Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas and Alberto Tejeda, and the destruction of the indigenous people of Spanish America, genocidal encounter.
In the year 1891, the Vatican decided to restore the Church's relevance, which was lost in the previous 4 centuries, particularly among the urban middle classes and the proletariat, which embraced secular liberalism and socialism, respectively. This term was led by Pope Leo XIII, who conducted a couple of preliminary steps, first consolidating a less reserved and more realistic approach toward modernity. Second, consolidating a positive position toward the practical theological interpretation by Thomas Aquinas, whom the Church viewed until this point as dangerous to the peaceful order of things and to public safety, I quote. This way, a new social Catholicism emerged. The new perception of modernity marked a change also in the Church's view of poverty. It was no longer seen as an individual failure, but as a result of political injustice. 10 important social encyclicals were published so far. The first, entitled Rerum Novarum, New Things, on Capital and Labor, by Leo XIII, was published on May of 1891. The last of this issue, Caritas in Veritate, on the integral human evolution, was published by Benedictus XVI on June 2009. You can see here both, the first and the last, and there are 8 in between, first one and last one of these encyclicals. Actually, there are books with hundreds of articles inside, very detailed, each of them. Okay. The common approach suggested in these encyclicals to remediate society and to progress was the social democratic one, carrying strong cooperative emphasis. This approach was defined in 1935 by the well-known Belgian philosopher and theologian Jacques Maritain as integral humanism. For that moment onwards, the Church dedicated its time to many social activities, encouraging priests and followers to assume power in governmental agencies, encouraging workers to establish fraternities, syndicates and labor movements, and addressing wealthy countries and international aid institutions to encourage development and progress into poor countries. The encyclicals approved, furthermore, ways to perform agrarian reforms and to empower peasant household and encourage also social research and advanced attitudes in family planning, education, and health. The social encyclicals dedicated many words to the theological rationale of the Church's new approach. It focused on the social essence of the mission of Christ, on the spirit of the gospel, and the witness of the poor, who acts in society and confirms reflectively the existence of God and his commitment to humanity. Yet, the theological discourse remained loyal to the Orthodox dogmas. It did not bridge the gap between the historical word and the divine one, the city of God. The sin of man, that is to say, losing his faith in God and his egocentrism, whose repentance is the imperative starting point for any enhancing social change, was viewed basically as individual concern and not the concern of sinful, oppressive policies, far detrimental than any personal sin. Revolting, striking, and other violent forms of social battles were prohibited, and direct political involvement of priests was categorically denied. The encyclical's tone was confusing in this regard. On the one hand, the documents encouraged the mixture between social activities on the one part and religious life on the other. On the other hand, the encyclicals stated, and I quote from the Vatican Constitution published on 1965, called Gaudium et Spes, or Delight and Hope, and I quote, "Let the layman not imagine that his pastors are always such experts that to every problem they can readily give him a concrete solution, or even that such is their mission. The way we may conclude that by adopting the Catholic social action since 1891, the encyclicals expressed imperative rhetoric valor, but they did not express sufficient operative audacity. This point was very clear in the Church's insistence on the outdated Orthodox theology, which apparently did not carry any real hopes to the poor and oppressed of the world. Let's see some of them. 1/7 part of the world are living in such conditions. People from Brazil. The Latin American challenge. In Latin America, where the largest Catholic population lives, there were pressure to break the limits set by the Church. Yet, as indicated in the Second Latin American Episcopal Council in Medellin, Colombia, on September of 1968, the Church's moderate perceptions were impractical within the Latin American context. Collaboration with communists was natural for anyone who sought to act on behalf of the poor. Struggle against the ruling powers, which were mostly military or oligarchic, were inevitable. Revolution and even violence were not condemnable. It was clear to the bishops in Latin America that unless the Church adopted an activist position to declare its preferential option for the poor, it would be rejected, as it indeed happened in Cuba and Mexico, where social revolutions really occurred. This was the slogan. Ya no basta conversar. We have to take the hand grenade or the fist and go to battle. Nonetheless, the greatest problem was the lack of theology that would support the necessary activism to promote social progress in Latin America. A theology without which one could not expect from priest and follower to commit to social struggle, often a very dangerous position, as indicated by the hundreds of assassinated priests, friars, bishops, and even archbishops for the last 60 years, 23 of them in Mexico alone in the past 6 years. Last one was killed last April in Mexico, alone. Everyone knew that initiating this fight without a strong theological support would lead to the same end as the Colombian priest Camilo Torres, who shifted his struggle for the poor of Colombia to the political channel by forming a movement of the so-called unaligned along with the communists, had to give up his soutane on June of 1965. He had to quit his political activities, joining the guerrilla, where he was eventually killed on February 1966. Some pictures of Camilo Torres. In the middle, was born in 1928, very young in that period, with followers, political followers, and with the poor children here. He was an activist in the poor neighborhoods of Bogota and other parts of Colombia. Here's his soutane, brought by his confidant 50 years after his death to an exhibition which took place 2 years ago, commemorating his 50th anniversary. This is his confidant, now 82, 83 years old. And this is a corner in her house commemorating Camilo Torres. As guerrilla fighter. Announcement on his death. Muerto Camilo Torres, el combate de Santander. The Peruvian priest Gustavo Gutierrez referred to this matter without a new orthodoxy, hence theology, which he named orthopraxis, based upon a critical reading of the Bible and the New Testament. There would be, he argued, no proper priest leadership in Latin America. Hence, Gutierrez published his book entitled Teología de la Liberación in 1971. This is Gustavo Gutierrez, still alive, 90 years old now. This is his book on the left. The English version, English translation, appeared in 1973. At the beginning, the theology of liberation sought to replace the terms development and progress in the Christian social teaching with the term liberation. According to Gutierrez, Jesus did not come to the world to lead the poor to progress in the next world, but to liberate them in the real world. The kingdom of heaven, he promised them, was actually on earth, a historical kingdom. Jesus came to take down from the cross the poor people, not vice versa. Moses, the first prophet and founder of the Old Testament, was sent to redeem the Jewish people, and so he did. Thus, the creation of the Jewish people and its salvation, along with the Exodus from Egypt and the revelation on Mount Sinai, happened as historical events in which the mundane city and the divine united. In this event, the apocalypse of Exodus chapter 19 and Genesis of Exodus chapter 3 became one historical unit. Obviously, Moses was first and foremost a political figure who committed as an official emissary of God a political act of liberation. The covenant and the laws he gave to the Jews, which were social laws per excellence, see for example the laws on Shabbat and Shemitah, the obligation towards the poor, the widows, the orphans, slaves and foreigners. Furthermore, when King Pharaoh refused to liberate the Hebrews, Moses did not hesitate in executing his force against him. He did so also against the Amaleks, against the sons of Korach, Datan, and Aviram, and against the follower of the golden calf. According to Gutierrez, the prophecy should be interpreted in the same spirit. All the prophets were sent by God to demand justice and order on earth alone. When they delivered their prophecies on the apocalypse, they spoke about a historical apocalypse. Some of the prophets were political figures, like Achiah, who crowned Yerovam as king of Israel, or Natan, who announced to David that a sword will never be removed from his home because of Bathsheba affair. Lastly, there was a question of sin. Sin, declared Gutierrez, was not a personal issue exclusively, as claimed by the church. The sin was a social one, too, a collective one. Hence, it was a sin of the legal, economic, political, and cultural institutions established by repressive regimes. Thus, repentance should not only target the private sphere as claimed by Orthodox theology, but the institutional and political spheres of decision-making as well. Only in this fashion would a just, solidary society rise and be able to address effectively all the sources of inequity and social and human rights violations. In case these goals were not to be achieved peacefully, the church should not fear from taking radical measures, and even violent ones, in order to act. Violence should not be justified, but in Latin America, where state violence was the norm, there were no other options sometimes. Consequently, once priests rebelled, like Camilo Torres, wrote Gutierrez, the soutanes should not have been removed since they were the church's best sons. The church official response to Gutierrez's manifest was only published on March 1984 in a document of the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, modern incarnation of the Inquisition, which criticized theology of liberation. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, on the picture, the head of the CDF, later Pope Benedictus XVI, criticized the theology of liberation, in which he claimed that the interpretation of the problem of poverty as a problem of structures independently of the individual sinner did not correspond to the perception of sin according to the church. Furthermore, the liberation theology, argued Ratzinger, was an immanent theology and not a proper transcendental theology, and as it should be. In other words, it reduced all sacred notions into the political reality, creating this way a temporal messianic vision, which was instrumental and detached from the mystery of God. The liberation theology ill-interpreted the founding epic story of Exodus. Moses was not sent to the Hebrews as a political leader, but as a prophet whose role was to summon the Hebrews to the covenant and their God, whom they have not recognized at all. And in order to establish its simplistic, historiocentric position, the liberation theology invented a new theological term, orthopraxis, thus presenting the Orthodox theology as a valueless and even hostile towards the poor. The document by the Holy Office further stressed that this antagonistic approach against the church was emphasized by presenting the struggle for the social justice in light of class conflict. Thus, once the liberation theology embraced this notion, it also accepted the ideology of class struggle and of violence as the main historical means of change. It emulated completely the values of dialogue and persuasion driven by the force of the love the neighbor as positive means for social change. In this way, the liberation theology misled its followers to think that solving their distress would happen by promoting imaginary and baseless myth about an equal society without classes. The greatest outcome of this myth, as seen in communist countries, was the vicious totalitarian regime. Consequently, the document concluded that the liberation theology did not contribute to the fight against poverty and injustice. This arduous mission was done so far and is going further to be done according to the principles of the social encyclicals of the Church, which are more successful in binding the social liberation and progress with deeper faith. Gutierrez reacted to this document in his composition from 1986, entitled "Truth Will Liberate You." He responded moderately and politely by indicating that he did not articulate his theory in terms of class conflict, nor did he ignore central Christian concept. Gutierrez explained that the liberation theology as a critical reflection on Christian praxis according to the divine word was not the main and most important act of Christianity, but a secondary one only. The most important procedure for a Christian believer was to conduct true Christian life, that is to say, deep spiritual life. The official church, which feared from possible retaliation ending up in a split of the Catholic Church, softened its tone and began adopting gradually the term liberation. The encyclical entitled Centesimus Annus of 1991, which commemorated the centennial appearance of Rerum Novarum, cited the word freedom 56 times in different contexts. The term liberation appeared there 4 times. The transformation was evident, particularly since the previous social encyclicals, Laborem Exercens, published in 1981, did not employ the term liberation at all, and the word freedom was only mentioned twice. Most importantly, Centesimus Annus declared to the followers of the liberation theology this, in the read, this appears in this encyclical. In the recent past, the sincere desire to be on the side of the oppressed and not to be cut off from the course of history had led many believers to seek in various ways an impossible compromise between Marxism and Christianity. Moving beyond all that was short-lived in these attempts. Present circumstances are leading to a reaffirmation of the positive value of an authentic theology of integral human liberation. Something happened in between. It seems then that no further word has to be mentioned in order to understand the Church's spirit once realizing that the liberation theology had been planting roots. A growing number of priests, of bishops, friars, and followers, even archbishops like Enrique, many churchmen, adopted this theology. The Church realized that theological scriptures in the spirit of liberation were disseminating while discussing issues such as racism, gender, and ethnic discrimination, as well as human rights, thus provoking the growing academic interest which appealed to many youngsters who searched their way to the Church. Various publication of theology of liberation of women, race, etc. On my visit to Mexico and Colombia, I had interviewed priests and friars who declared it openly. Official scholastic documents confirmed it too, employing the terms such as liberation, development and liberation, freedom, perhaps the most surprising twist of affairs was the appointment of Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, in 2013 as Pope Francis. Bergoglio belonged to the Church of the Poor, and in Argentina, a branch of the Liberation Church. His appointment testified to the fact that beyond his intellectual and personal qualifications, of course, the entire liberation theology has been adopted by the Cardinal Forum in the Conclave with its 115 members. Is Cardinal Buenos Aires kissing the legs of addicted. Here's the name he took also, Franciscus. As I said, he's the man who gives us this spirit of peace, poor man. How I would like a church that is poor and for the poor. It is no wonder why Ben-Gurion adopted the name of Francisco. I will skip this. Okay. And one of his first acts was to invite Gustavo Gutierrez to Rome. You can see him in September 2013. Okay? A few minutes, okay? Okay. Francis summoned also Gustavo Gutierrez to his office a year later. Pope Francis removed the embargo ad divinis casted upon Nicaraguan Father Miguel de Acosta Brockman, this guy. He was, Miguel de Acosta, who died last year, was a member of the Church of the Poor and an activist. In the 70s, he joined the Sandinista Marxist guerrilla movement in Nicaragua, which fought against the dictatorship of General Anastasio Somoza. Several years after the movement victory in 1979, he was appointed the foreign minister of Nicaragua, and later on as president of the 63rd United Nations General Assembly. The embargo casted on by Pope John Paul II in 1984 was justified by the fact that Acosta remained loyal to Marxism and acting as a state official on behalf of the Marxist government, which took power by force. So he got back his mundane. Later on, Pope Francis declared Salvador assassinated Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was killed by giving a mass in 1980, as a martyr. Okay, I want to finish now. Okay, conclusion. It appears that despite the attacks on the liberation theology and the criticism against it, it managed to settle in the hearts of Latin American and Third World nations, and to reach the leadership of the Catholic Church. Would it have the power to change the harsh reality in many Latin American countries? I doubt it very much. The origins of the problem and the solution as well reside probably in the political sphere as ever before. In that sphere, the presence of the Church is strong, not enough yet. And if it has any influence, as indicated in the appointment of the Paraguayan Bishop Fernando Lugo to presidency in 2008, it comes with a price of removing the emissary from his soutane, as demonstrated in the story of de Acosta and of Camilo Torres. At the same time, doubtlessly a new humanistic Catholic Christian approach has been created. In my view, Catholicism that converted its religion and turned the Church into a committed political body, which is not intimidated by conflicts, although it suffers from them, as indicated by the assassination of dozens amongst its agents. The younger priests with whom I have met in America leave no doubt regards to the fundamental religious change, if not a complete religious convert, which happened within the Catholic Church. Thank you.
The last speaker is Federico Dal Bo, holds a PhD in translation studies from the University of Bologna and a PhD in Jewish studies from the Free University of Berlin. He worked as teaching assistant in theoretical philosophy at the University of Bologna and as a research assistant at the Institute for Jewish Studies at the Free University of Berlin. Currently holds a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship at the Autonomous University of Barcelona in connection with the international project, the Latin Talmud, directed by Prof. Alexander Fidora. His forthcoming publication is a text on the 13th century Spanish Kabbalah, Emanation and Philosophy of Language, an introduction to Joseph Ben Abraham Gicatilla. Jerusalem, Los Angeles, Gary Press, 2018.
Thank you. It's not that essential. Thank you. Much more detailed.
Complete.
Thank you. This wasn't necessary. So we are going back in time, and we are leaving lovely presentation from Latin America. Still, we are staying in our Latin country, more or less, in Italy, and specifically my city, Ferrara, just by chance, because I have to thank Joseph Bonfiglioli, who is a friend of my mother. It's kind of typical. She gave it to me as an expertise manuscript, a rare printed version of a text, which then is the text I'm going to talk about. And apparently it emerged to be an interesting, text because it is pretty rare. It speaks about an Italian Jew from possibly Ferrara who converted during Napoleonic domination in Italy, and he also wrote a long 80-90 pages treatise on this just to justify his decision. So it's pretty important for historical reasons. It's even not so bad theologically speaking. So in 1800, Ludovico Giuseppe Franceschi printed a booklet about his decision of leaving the Jewish community of Ferrara and converted to Christianity. The booklet has a very long detailed title, which I read just in English. Dissertation of the neophyte Ludovico Giuseppe Franceschi as answer to some difficulties presented to him during the first examination of the catechumenicals on the 11th of July by the Jews, already arranged, partially discussed, required and recorded in the minutes of the second examination that has followed on the 22nd of the same month, in order to justify his careful deliberation of leaving Judaism and embracing Christianity. So it's almost said there, everything is already there. I hardly need to speak about this. Just a few historical notes. I'm sorry, it doesn't fit in. So the dissertation actually provides some important details about the historical, legal and religious circumstances of the conversion of a Jewish individual to Napoleonic Italy. A careful examination of this text will show that Napoleon's legal initiatives in favor of the emancipation of the Jews, declaring Judaism as one of the official religions, or postponed in 1808, had an impact on the traditional Catholic assumption that Judaism would be an outdated, dangerous faith. The Ecumenical Institute in Ferrara is more or less here, probably. Probably it is here. That is the house of my former classmate, actually. Has been destroyed, the church. An historian said that it should be in this square, number 5. That's what I got from Google Maps. So it should be around here. It was an institution that was established for the conversion of the Jews. So at first, one should appreciate that the process of conversion of a Jew in modern Italy required a number of legal steps to be followed. First of all, it is evident that the Jew was to be supported in his decision by a Catholic organization. In the present case, this institution was the Catechumenical Institute of Ferrara. The Catechumenical Institute, from the Greek catechumenos, or one being educated, was originally established in 1534 in Rome by Ignazio de Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. The main purpose of this institution was educating adults to the Christian religion and support them in the process of conversion. This institution typically addressed Jews, reflecting the Christian assumption that final deliverance would eventually come only where the rest of Israel did actually convert. Director of this institution was established in 1584 in Ferrara, so probably there somewhere, where a prominent Jewish community was flourishing and hosted 10 synagogues, with an average population of 2,000 Jewish individuals. So I'm skipping just for your sake. Sorry, can't. Oh, so if we look in a document published by the Austrian authorities, actually I found this text in L'Educatore Israelita, so it's a Jewish newspaper. It publishes just it's a long text, but for us, is there any way to make it a full screen without cutting the image? I'm sorry. No, it doesn't work like this. So anyhow, the most important thing is this rule is the article number 6 that says you can convert. Of course, you are liable to convert, but you should not. Thank you. Well, you should not be compelled, forced, or convicted to do so. Should be. Okay, I'm sorry about that. It's my fault. So anyhow, similar presuppositions are reflected in both title and content of Ludovico Giuseppe Franceschi dissertation. While reading the title and a few pages of his dissertation, it is evident that he has been encouraged to convert by a Catholic, the Count Ludovico Gnoli, and underwent a long period of examination. Both the parties involved, the Jewish community and the Catholic, just scroll down, and the Jewish community and the Catholic Church. A previous decree had established that this examination, called Esperimento in Italian, would last 4 months and allowed the representatives of each faith to prove the individual goodwill and liberty to convert to Christianity. The historical setting of his conversion of this Franceschi is also worth mentioning. After enjoying a golden era in the Renaissance, Ferrara was eventually absorbed to the state of the church in 1598, suffering from an irreversible decline. After 200 years of papal domination, Ferrara joined the Napoleonic Cisalpine Republic in 1796. At the time of Franceschi's conversion, 1808, Ferrara had been freed from papal domination for 10 years. It belonged to the short-living Regno d'Italia, Napoleonic client state under French ruling. Ferrara would surely endorse the Napoleonic initiative to free the Jews from the ghettos, accord them full citizenship, and to exempt them from special taxes. Yet, this institution appears to be still in force. As far as the Jews might be exempt from paying the Catholic institution, the religious existence was virtually still under the influence of the catechumenical, this dissertation clearly proves. So, so that's the text, as we've seen. So nothing is known about Ludovico Giuseppe Franceschi. His first name probably be an homage to his godfather, the aforementioned Ludovico Gnoli, and whose middle name Giuseppe will reflect a Jewish name, probably. Interestingly enough, Count Ludovico Gnoli is mentioned also in a document from a psychiatric institution in North Italy, where he was hosted for a short period of time and eventually released as appearing to be mentally in good shape. Just to say he wasn't driven by a madman, that's important to us just to show that these guys actually existed. In the archives in Ferrara I haven't found anything about Ludovico, so I will search further, but till now there is no reflection about these archives. In any case, this dissertation emerged from Ludovico Giuseppe Franceschi to Esperimenti. This dissertation, probably one of the last documentation available of an Italian Jew converting to Christianity by means of a Catholical Institute, was published twice. First time in 1808 by the Brinkhouse Francesco Pomatelli of Ferrara, which is the edition I have here, dedicated to Count Ludovico Gnoli. A second time with more revisions in 1815 by the publishing house Tipi Bianchi e Negri di Ferrara, dedicated to Maximilian Verzak, Bishop of Zagabria. So the dissertation clearly has a legal and theological purpose. At first, it serves to document the process of conversion was valid and did not take place under duress. Accordingly, Franceschi declares in legal terms that he converted due to his personal persuasion and was by no means obliged, forced or compelled to leave Judaism. These legal precautions is clearly anticipated in the title of the dissertation itself. The theological dimension of the dissertation is important as its legal one. As requested by aforementioned legislation, whoever wished to convert to Christianity had to pass a series of experimentations or esperimenti, proving his faith and evidencing his education and the fundamental principles of a new religion. Most of the dissertation is indeed devoted to justify Franceschi's choice of leaving Judaism and embracing Christianity. This dissertation is 54 pages long and consists of 66 units, actually 55 because there is a small mistake in the numeration, that treat a large number of topics. I'm not skipping here because the text I've given to read for longer. His lack of literacy in Hebrew is particularly evident when treating a passage from the prophet Jeremiah. Franceschi addresses a passage from the prophet but would anticipate God's final decision of giving a new law to a new people, a universal gospel to the entire humanity. Franceschi quotes in Italian from the prophet Jeremiah, and here I translate it into, sorry, this is when he says it's okay, he wants to convert. This is the translation into Italian, translation from Italian to English that I made for your sake. So, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, and I will make a new alliance, nuova alleanza, with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant, pacto, that I made with the fathers by the day when I took them by the hands to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So it's nothing particularly new in this quotation. But then he makes this remark. He says, therefore God promises a new alliance, a new covenant, wholly different from the one which he contracted with them when he got them out of Egypt. And yet this alliance with Moses had to last until the promulgation of the other. Nor do you want to make sophism on the word alliance and covenant, as it were not the same as law, as the Jews did. So actually, I don't find this remark extremely clear, but to me, it is important to read hermeneutically this passage because there is a mistake in the sense that, notably enough, the original Hebrew text exactly uses the same word, brit, in both cases. Consequently, there would be no need for distinguishing between an elder from older pact between God and his people. In truth, Franceschi's loose translation clearly depends on the Latin version of this verse that inconsistently renders the common Hebrew term brit as foetus novum and as pactum, as you can see just reading from the Vulgata. Actually, okay, foetus novum and pactum, and in Hebrew we have brit, brit chadasha, velo kibarit. So it's the same very thing. And actually, there is also a small pun because brit chadasha is, as we know, also a translation for into Hebrew of gospel. So since he is arguing about not to sophisticize about the difference in words between patto e alleanza, that makes me think that he was at least translating from the Vulgate, or somebody who just read the Vulgate told him that it were two different words. So this is important to us because it shows that Franceschi has no command of scripture, has no command of rabbinic literature, and so this is a little premise very important to us to understand the core of his theological argumentation, which is why should one then, being Jewish, convert to Christianity? And he gives this long text, so therefore to conclude, the law of Moses should not last forever. So a Jew should convert because the law is outdated, it's just expired. Because Moses himself said it plainly clear by announcing new prophets similar to him, because the prophets said it more clearly by preaching new law, new priesthood, and a new sacrificial victims, which is of course Jesus. Because such is the nature of the Mosaic law, which cannot be universal for all people under the Messiah. Because that law of the Christians, which is recognized as good by the Jews themselves, condemns the Mosaic as abrogated. Finally, because God himself has made it impossible, as he is the first one, not to observe his part of the covenant. So, this point is pretty important because it's the core of the dissertation. So, we have seen from the translation, he probably couldn't read Hebrew, or couldn't understand Hebrew anyhow, if he could read it. And he was relying on second sources, or probably his teachers. In this point, it is important because he says that one should convert from Judaism to Christianity because it is impossible to follow the law. And this is a very careful argument. Franceschi develops his argument carefully. At first he avoids mentioning that the rabbinic precepts obviously are 613. Elazar says, quite loosely, that there are more or less 600 precepts. Say 600 più precetti, so more or less 600. So leaving the implication that then one could think that there are 610. This slight inaccuracy allows him to imply that the Jewish law actually consists of two different bodies, a core of 10 commandments and a bulk of 600 precepts. The 10 commandments would reflect God's immutable natural law, legge naturale, this quotation, and which enjoy a true perpetual eternal validity. What follows from this? Do you know what follows? It follows that that part of the Mosaic law, so the 10 commandments, which is called moral, and contains in the Decalogue the precepts of the two tablets that still subsist. So after removing the moral, one would say spiritual, component from the Jewish law, the rest of the 600 precepts would only survive as a carnal body, empty of life. Accordingly, Franceschi concludes that the very body of the Jewish law depends on the moral nature of the 10 commandments that bring it to life. Otherwise, the Jewish law is only a sack of precepts that notify the Jews as a hypertrophic development of God's given moral law. But the rest of the law, that is to say, all the 600 and more precepts, of which you can boast so much, were not promulgated in a similar form, and yet nothing is demanded that they should last until they are likewise revoked. It is not necessary that it demands it, because God is liable, padrone, to revoke it as he wants. And for time's sake, I couldn't look into Franceschi's elaboration on the expression "aulam," which he says it means not forever, but just for a specific portion of time. So it is it's just something temporary. So one should appreciate how this argumentation exhibits a sort of Old Testamentarian, if not properly Jewish nature. A distinction between two similar notions, the Jewish law and the Ten Commandments, is carefully maintained due to a number of details a common reader would tend to overlook. Regardless of the question whether Franceschi was able to argue in this way or not, it is notable that the Ecumenical Institute of Ferrara has managed to orient the discussion, especially paying attention to the Jewish sensibility to the detail, typically exemplified in the Midrash. Aside from Catholic content, the argumentation reported in the Dissertazione exhibits a genuine Midrash nature. This suggests that the Catholic Church had eventually become aware of the necessity of persuading the Jews by imitating or mimicking Jewish hermeneutics. Ironically enough, the ability of converting depends on the ability of observing Jewish reading of Scripture. And then I come to the second point, shorter. How is it impractical to follow Jewish law? The dissertation follows a very specific train of thought. Although it occasionally mentions some fundamental assumptions of Jewish faith, of the Christian faith, interesting mistake by my side, such as the dogma of the incarnation, the dissertation actually resonates with the typically Jewish interest of determining the believer's relationship to the divine law. Franceschi doesn't argument too differently from a rabbi. He constantly clarifies his faith according to his relation to the divine law. This divine law no longer coincides with the Jewish law as a body of more than 600 precepts. Yet, he still orients Franceschi's commitment with religion. In other terms, he justifies his conversion to Christianity as a reaction to the outdated character of the Jewish law. However, the impractical character of the Jewish law is argued subtly, negotiating between the actual Jewish rituals that he would modernly call principle of reality. Franceschi doesn't maintain the Jewish law is impractical because of the numbers of the requirements. Indeed, he accuses rabbis to develop an hypertrophic body of laws, and exactly makes an example, and says, would it be possible for all the people to observe the law of Moses? Could they all travel 3 times a year to Jerusalem from Italy, France, England, and America to celebrate the feast? Okay, now yes, but at the time it would be much more difficult. Now would they be able, even if they would kept traveling continuously back and forth? Could all the firstborn be presented to the temple 40 days or so after their birth? Could all men gather in one single Jerusalem? Don't you see that this is impossible? Therefore, the Messiah must give another universal law for the whole world, yet the one of Moses had to last until his coming and no longer. So despite his polemical, almost sarcastic tone, Franceschi addresses here an important issue, the ethnic-specific nature of Jewish law. Franceschi evidences his tendentious attitude, especially when failing to mention the 2 well-known assumptions in Judaism. First, the Jewish law is mandatory only to Jewish people, who have the historical and theological role to bring humanity to worship the true God. Secondly, the rest of humanity is rather required to preserve the 7 Noachic laws of that we have an universal, ethnically neutral character. Rabbinic Judaism doesn't disqualify non-Jewish individuals from salvation, under the assumption that God is acknowledged as the Lord. It is difficult to determine whether Franceschi wasn't informed about the distinction between Noahide and rabbinic laws, or misinformed either by the Ecumenical Institute or his preceptors. In any case, it is important to emphasize how the alleged outdated impractical characters of Jewish law is the main reason for Franceschi's conversion to Christianity. So I conclude skipping how he treats the figure of Jesus in Islam, just because of time. And I come to one of the most polemical points in his dissertation. The dissertation overall offers a special perception of Jewishness. Franceschi conceived of being Jewish as a condition of disadvantage, being bound to the Jewish law that is an outdated and incapable of innovation. Franceschi constantly describes Jewishness as a burden from which he was lucky enough to escape due to the pitiful intervention of his Catholic mentors. Therefore, the spirit of his dissertation can be summarized in a quite crude statement. Yes, for my misfortune, Sventura, I was born Jewish, and as a Jew I have lived until now. And this is precisely what causes me to suffer. Okay, perché mi crucia, so what I'm a little annoyed or displeased from. But with grace of my Lord Jesus Christ, who had died to enlighten me, although I was born Jewish, I will not die Jewish. Which is, se ebreo sono nato, ebreo non morirò. So, as a condition of moral and legal minority, Jewishness exhibits no positive nature. Therefore, Franceschi wishes to simply be removed from it with no rest, and I won't die Jewish. So, in this very fast survey of the dissertation, I hope I could prove that, on the one hand, the condition of the Jews in Italy under Napoleonic domination was still the same as during the papal domination in Italy. Jews were encouraged to convert, although it's not really clear how they convert and what position he played in his community in Ferrara before converting. Apparently, these rules required him to at least engage in 4 months of disputation with community members and a rabbi. I didn't mention it, but he probably had to dispute with an important rabbi from North Italy, but it doesn't clear because it just mentioned Signor Neppi, so I believe it should be Yechiel Neppi, who was a prominent rabbi in Italy, but it's not clear. And on the other hand, he shows that he did convert by arguing in a very subtle way on the temporary nature of the Jewish law, on the impossibility of observing the Jewish law, and at the same time trying to show that you should distinguish very carefully, according to the presentation of Jewish law to the people of Israel, between 10 commandments and the whole bulk of the precepts of the rabbinic law. Just this quoting from, and I'm finished, quoting from Midrash, which is well known when he says, he shows how the 10 words danced before the people of Israel. So by implying just 10 words were, so the 10 commandments were shown, so the rest is just an invention. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for these talks, and thank you to the organizers. Nice to be here, always. So with your permission, I'm going to reverse the order. I'm going to start with Federico, and then we'll move from the end to the beginning, just to make things a little more interesting. So beginning with Federico's paper, I was reading, listening to the text you were quoting, and really what I wonder is who are the potential readers of the text, which what kind of caught my attention was the fact that you said not only was it printed, it was reprinted. It was printed twice, which means at least theoretically there was a readership. And I wonder who Franceschi actually was writing for, who he thought would, and who the printers thought that would be reading the text. And it's interesting that, to me, that despite the fact that, as you note, Federico is not, at least I don't think I'm not giving grades to anybody, I don't think he's such a great theologian. You said that, he clearly has very, very little knowledge. His Jewish education was very poor, so it seems. For example, he doesn't quote any rabbinic sources at all. It's a very, in that sense, a very Christian text. It's all the Bible, right? He doesn't. No, he does? Well, at least you didn't bring any. Okay. But it seems, anyway, at least according to what you said, that his Jewish education was quite weak. But it's interesting to me that he decided he could have, if this was just kind of a formula, he could have copied the regular arguments against, for conversion, but he decided to formulate his own theology. As, you know, for whatever it's worth, he actually brought his own ideas about, maybe not entirely original, but his own ideas about Judaism and Christianity. And I think that, to me, this really kind of returns to an issue that I think is at the base of a lot of discussion of conversion, even today, is the issue of sincerity and authenticity. Right? He's trying to prove that his conversion is authentic. I don't know, again, to whom he's trying to prove it. Is this his own? Is it an inner? Is this his confessions? His attempt to explain to the world, to his family? I guess we will never know because we don't really know very much about him. But there is an issue here of and maybe to the quite possibly to the people who are behind the scenes, the receivers. That he is sincere in some way, or and making his conversion really valid. And really, I'm going to throw out an idea here that is completely baseless, but here that's what I'm here for. Is that actually the kind of amateurish nature of his theology, in a sense, adds to the authenticity. In other words, he's not just regurgitating the same. He could have, he could have just quoted Isaiah 53 and, just done that, suffering servant. He could have done that, but he's doing something, in a sense, to the readers, maybe, possibly, maybe not, that adds to the feeling that he's actually gone through a process himself. And one other note about this text is, the feeling that I had is really that he ends with is that this universalism, which is maybe kind of this phenomenon of early modernity, and it seems is generally in keeping with that Napoleonic era. This theme of I would say that Judaism is inappropriate to the universal ideals that are starting to be promoted in that area, and this area of early modernity, and that even the particularity is almost a stain, right? It's almost a sin, an idea which, by the way, is still around in many ways, and I think is part of modern thinking of religion. That particularity is something that has to be defended, specifically because as he says, right, Judaism can't be observed by everybody, and I don't even think he means that in the practical term. He says, in the practical term, nobody can come to the whole world is not able to come to Jerusalem, even though, by the way, in the Sefer Chaliyah it says specifically that the whole world will come to Jerusalem, but he kind of overlooks that. But I think that the feeling that comes from that saying is that there's something wrong about having a religion that's so particular. And that's, I think, an interesting feature of the kind of, what I feel is a kind of modernism. So, continuing to these kind of stories of religious modernity, we're going to come right to Eitan with the really contemporary feeling of this really amazing story, I think, of the conversion of the church within the conversion of the church to modernity, as I see it, within a fairly short span of time, right? Within a few decades. Really fascinating story. And reading, hearing you speak about the liberation of theology, and especially the most radical, I understand, elements of it. It seems very secular in many ways, and it seems like a secularization. And in that sense, right, the criticism of it is definitely kind of, and maybe also within this kind of general field of religious humanism that was popular in the 20th century, which we may or may not be beyond that, but it's that in that sense I think it's part of that, but also very very secular and also very material and concrete. And I wonder, two kind of thoughts came to my mind with regard to this. The first thing The first thought is, how does this relate? And we actually spoke about this a little earlier, to the huge wave, and I checked the numbers a little bit about evangelical Christianity that has come into South America. And according to the numbers I checked, there are currently about 64 million evangelical Christians in South America, which is a lot, compared to something like 50,000 in the year 1900. So huge growth, and apparently about 500,000 new evangelicals in Brazil every year. These are obviously evangelical statistics, but even if they're less, it's still a lot of people. So I can think of it in both ways. I mean, is this, well, of course it could be completely unrelated, but is this a reaction? Because you could argue that in evangelical theology, when I did work on evangelical missionaries, one of the things that they stress is that you're only saved through faith, not through works. So the issue is faith, and not this kind of social, very much against that kind of social message. On the other hand, there is what some have called the wealth and health theology of evangelical. So it could also be, you could also see it as part of the same current. Also, you could also be seen as part of the losing, the Catholic Church kind of losing ground and trying to save itself through different as a reaction. So I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of out of my field. I'm not sure how those things work out, but I'm pretty sure there is some sort of action and reaction between those two currents. The other issue is the issue of politics, and I wonder, when you spoke about the issue of politics, and I wonder, is the church really, the people who are espousing this kind of theology, are they really involved in politics in the way that, I mean, we think of, for example, the way in South Korea in 1988, the church there played a very significant role in getting rid of the dictatorship. And I wonder, are we talking about an activism, political activism, or is this kind of universalist neutrality? In other words, are we talking about the poor, or are we talking about poverty? And I feel that some of the talk that is kind of that you mentioned, that has come, some of the theology that's coming out of the Catholic Church sounds more like aiding the poor, less like really political activism. But I may be wrong. I mean, is there the question is this being translated into real political action in the real way, and not just theology? And I wonder about that. So that's about it in that regard. I'll say a few words about Simon. Really the question of rebaptism is an interesting one. I would have wanted to hear more about the political context of when, what exactly is it, because I feel there is a possibility. I mean, we're talking about we're moving from modernity into antiquity, but there is we have you too, much like Eitan, spoke of a new theology that comes, and the question is this fracturing of theology, is it a reflection of a political reality, some kind of political context? It's my ignorance, I don't know. Is this a theology of crisis or not? So anything that you could say about that. And maybe one last thing, you talked about a pamphlet circulated in 6th century Antioch, and I wonder about dissemination. How exactly does that work? Obviously it wasn't printed as a tract and given out. It's a world before paper. But how does that work? How does dissemination of heresy work in 6th century heresy? Apologize. Don't be judgmental about the theology I don't know anything about. But about heterodoxy, how does it work in 6th century Antioch? So just a question for that. I think that's enough.
Thank you to Respondent. Any comment or question to Respondent?
So Thank you. Well, first of all, I have to say I got the impression that I've been a little short because I had to skip a longer paper that I thought you might have read earlier. So you have seen that, I'm sorry, I'm so direct. You might have seen then quoted 3-4 times these rabbinic sources that Franceschi was using in a deformed way. So that's my misunderstanding between our communication. Otherwise, I would have claimed in a different way by saying that Franceschi doesn't mention almost anywhere Christian sources. He never mentions, for instance, Paul. So I agree with you, he's not a great theologian, but anyhow, he manages not to use all the stuff by saying Paul has come and has said that the Jewish law brings to sin, so with sin then comes God, the Son of God who saves us. He is being much more subtle by arguing on the core of the Jewish law by saying, you should look carefully, for instance, in some Kodash, in which it is said, the Jewish law has been displayed to the Jewish people as 10 Commandments dancing. So the implication is that 10 precepts were given and the rest is just an invention. So it is a material, but it doesn't mention Paul. That makes it a little more difficult to argue in a apparently Jewish way out from the text. Then he has problems in literacy, because as shown with this quotation, it's the most important quotation in the text about Alleanza e Patto. He doesn't rely on Hebrew. So who could have been the readers of this text? I believe that it was I don't think there were so many Jews, Ferrara especially, who wanted to read this kind of text and argue so much. I think it's much more a question of power, so that the Christian Catholic Church in Ferrara could share under Napoleon domination. They had still held could still hold the Jewish community and show over to Napoleon dominance that he might have, so to speak, about immanent and transcendental power. Napoleon could have the earth, but they still have the spirit, and so they could even be so much persuasive to bring Jews to convert. So the readers might be internal in the sense, for the sake of the Catholic Church in Ferrara, to share we are still here, and Napoleon is going to pass.
I think that the theology of opened the way to the church, or the church's way into politics. Church was more a side of politics all its history. And then came the theology of liberation that gave way, theologically, gave way to be involved in politics. Still being Christian, but theologically be able to involve in politics. How? By taking all the main Christian mysteries, eschatology, God, Jesus, and bringing down to history. Okay? Unite them to the historical essence of life, to reality. This was the way, this was the idea of the theology of liberation, and that he did. Now, Ratzinger grasped this way of, how to call it, this maneuver, and attacked directly this one. But this was the case. And then they came to the example of Israel, of the Jewish people. What was Moses? More prophet or more politician? Actually, he was both. but he took a nation from one place to another. He gave them covenant, he gave them laws. He was there. Moses was there, and God also was there in the camp, in his coffin, moving with the people of Israel from place to place. He was there. He was quite mundane. It was part of the life, of the real life of history. So this is, I think, the contribution, the great contribution of the theology of liberation is this. And the church couldn't argue because it was different. It is a different Christianity, actually. And they called it also New Christendom. This is the name given by Jacques Maritain. Yet in 1935 he spoke about New Christendom because he understood at that time that the church should be that. Later came Gutierrez and made the work, made the job. Yes. Then I think that theologically there's a new era, and speaking with priests, speaking with fathers in Latin America, you can see it. They are dedicated, they are committed to the people. They are fighting for them. They are building roads and digging wells and building casas de campesino, casas de pueblo. They do everything secular. Besides, they give a service and they do other things, but they are dedicated to the people themselves. I could see it. I talked with them. I saw it, and it was impressive. Really impressive. Really. About evangelism. Yes, in Brazil, more than other places, because Brazil is less Catholic than other places. The Portuguese made less. They were less committed to evangelization of the people of Brazil in the time of the colony. The Spanish were more committed to this and made it cruelly also. So in Spanish America, evangelism is less
Popular?
No, less popular, less that you can see it, less visible. Yes. There's there in the middle classes, especially. Suddenly, I saw these couples are moving in the villages, of course, in the villages also, and they give classes. They give classes of Bible. And they summon, this is very interesting, they summon the women also. It's a very, very original way of delivering religion. They summon the women also, and they're sitting together, women and men, and are reading Bible, not the New Testament, the Bible itself. It's very interesting. Yes, Protestantism is more committed to, more close to the Bible than the New Testament. So it is new for the campesinos, or new for the people in the middle classes in Latin America, but I think that, generally speaking, that Latin America is the 85%, 90% is still Catholic.
I can answer your question separately. Or I can do it now if you want. Okay. So in reverse order, the sort of short answer to the dissemination of heresy question is that the latent energies of celibate men have tremendous potential for knowledge distribution. Severus himself, when he's talking about the pamphlet, says it was pressed into his hands when he was walking through the streets of Antioch shortly after his ordination. At the time, it's not clear that that would have been a heresy. Severus doesn't come from Antioch originally. He's not part of the clergy. He doesn't come up through the ranks. He's he is a monk in Palestine and then an advocate for anti-Chalcedonianism in Constantinople, and is then made bishop of Antioch. So at the time in which he was approached with the pamphlet, it is entirely possible that his petitioners thought that there was a real possibility of him siding with them in the debate over rigorism, or the reception of pro-Chalcedonian converts. More generally, Severus provides a fairly good model for how things are distributed during this period. He's self-conscious in the distribution of his materials. To cite two tangible examples, the two subsequent letters that I cited in the presentation of him summarizing his treatise both include either promises to append copies of the treatise to his correspondent, or suggestions as to where they can obtain it. He seems to have used monasteries or monastic allies throughout the Mediterranean as sort of distribution nodes as well. Subsequently, as he becomes part of the church's canon, he's recycled and distributed in various ways. But the other one was political context. Rigorism in this case is both a crisis response and not a crisis response in some ways. Most of the groups that I talked about emerge in contexts and periods where, in the case of Theodotus, he becomes the focus of the rigorist movement in Alexandria after the triumph of anti-Chalcedonianism locally. So, the same is true for the Syrian groups who emerge under Severus's short patriarchate. They then seem to flourish separately once, in moments of crisis, once the sort of formal structures of the episcopate are removed, and they're allowed to present themselves to the community unmediated and without the chastisement of anti-rigorous bishops. There is a degree to which anti-rigorism has a decided political response. Severus is fairly specific about the fact that he's constructing his vision of, or his more lenient vision of reception, in large part because he thinks it will get more converts. The more you treat the sacraments that people received or had received previously as alien, seemingly the less likely you are to convince them that they should come join your movement. Seems to be his concern. Whereas the rigorous seem at least partially motivated by resentment, though I don't have a good model for that. It flourishes in more reactionary circles within the anti-Chalcedonian community and seems to be driven by moments of persecution and then stabilization. So they seem to be reacting to that. They seem dissatisfied in a very visceral way with the more lenient and liberal approaches. But that's as much as unfortunately, there's not more from within the communities themselves, so that's pretty much as much as I can say.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Just a few things about the Latin American issue, which is close to my heart. Just to say that the countries that are most evangelical and Pentecostal are not Brazil, actually. They're Guatemala and El Salvador, which is more than 50%, at least in El Salvador. In Guatemala, there was also a Pentecostal president, Rios Montt, who died, I think, not too long ago, and was charged for human rights violations. And I think the number is now about between 65 to 70% Catholic, and the rest evangelical, Pentecostal, and other things. I think that is according to the 2010 Pew Research or something of that sort. Other than that, I just wanted to add to what Eitan was saying, and just complex maybe a little bit, that while priests may have not been directly involved in politics, Catholicism, I think, has always been a very, very important part of politics in Latin America. Especially also in other places, especially when it comes to constructing nationalism. And if we think about indigenous communities, their system of government inside the community is based or is legitimized by the Catholic Church. and by Catholic risk. So their policy is very, very political. Just to add what Eitan was giving on a broader national level to the more smaller, complex, micro level.
Thanks for the figures. I'm going to check them again. This is the last that I know. But about politics, yes, church was always close to the conservative politics in Latin America. Always, they had concordant. For example, in Colombia. From 1884, there's a concordant, or 1886 concordant that was confirmed again and again, until these days, ever close to the state, and to the conservative parties, especially, because they funded them and they supported them. They gave them the way to work, to influence in society, to take basic fundamental education on themselves, to operate the missions they like to do, and to influence the studying programs in university and high schools. So what Gutierrez and others, those theologians of liberation, wanted to separate church from the conservative part of society and let them be more liberal, more democratic, more social democratic even. And this happened more or less. You can see it. For example, the Samuel Ruiz, the bishop of Chiapas, yes, he worked with the Indians in Chiapas. He encouraged them to make or to organize the first Indian Congress. Through it, they could speak for themselves, by themselves, and represent themselves. Since 1974, there's a Congress, Indian Congress. When the Zapatista rebelled in January 1994, he supported the rebellion. It was a bloody rebellion of 12 days only, but it lasted for 7 years. And at last, all the rebellion, 22 commanders of the Zapatistas entered the national parliament with ski masks and T-shirts of Che Guevara, yes, in order to speak or to convince the parliament to pass a law, the law on Indian culture and civil rights that was passed in 2001. What was a work or a challenge or an encouragement of Samuel Ruiz, the bishop of Chiapas. It was part of this church. So you can see fascinating phenomena in this context, and I see them. So I think something happened also. There's a change. The church became more liberal, more social democrat in Latin America than before.
Okay. Please.
You made a statement, Eitan, especially in your reply, you know, that something like the church, the Catholic Church suddenly discovered politics or something. But, I mean, the whole theology and the thought of, you know, we go back to Augustine and St. Thomas and you know, and Maritain, but I cannot see what needs to be explained is how the Catholic Church, a church whose theology emphasizes poverty, etc., was always aligned itself with the conservatives in South America or anywhere. And I think this is what needs to be explained. And I think it comes out very well with the, you know, the liberationist theory. I remember many years ago, I think it my first or second year here, so it's 73 or 74. Probably most of you weren't born then. But Ivan Illich came to Beersheba, and he didn't talk about education, although everybody wanted him to talk about education. And he actually talked about this, and he said, "I cannot understand my fellow priests. I cannot understand, the Holy Father." He actually said this stuff. And it's not the Catholicism, the Catholicism I know. And very, very moving. And I think what needs to be explained is how they didn't grab it with two hands.
So what is the question actually?
How the church, how the church didn't grab this? This is a modern version of what's needed. The priests are there, as you showed us with all your pictures here, working in these poor conditions, trying to help people, and there is something basically wrong with society, and these things have to be addressed. If we're serious Catholics, if we act also, one finds this amongst other thinkers, Catholic thinkers.
I think the poverty is a huge problem, huge international problem. The church could be or can be only one part of the solution, but not the whole. Yes, and I think it gives its influence inside. It gives it some, yes, but the church can now is a better church than ever, but it still can't solve the problem of the poverty in the world.
Yeah, but it's got to try. It's got to align itself.
It does it. I think it does it. Yeah, I think it does it. Yes. As far as I know, it does it or try to do it.
Last question, and I'm going to close the debate. So I have a question to Dal Bo. I'm wondering if Franceschi mentioned sometimes Apostle Paul in his process of conversion to Christianity. It's a curiosity. He doesn't have.
Well, I don't really remember. No, learn it by heart. It's not that important. But let's say he mentions the name somewhere, but he doesn't use Paul to argue that then Judaism should be left for sake of Christianity. So the point was that he is trying to argument that one should leave the Jewish community and then convert to Christianity, because if you're elaborating now almost midrashic way on the way in which the Jewish law is given by the scripture itself or the rabbinic tradition itself, it is shown that is not the core is not what has been given to the Jewish people, but what has been given to all humanity. So it's much more subtle. It's not quoting, it's not using Paul. Why? I don't know. It might be that the strategy was to move subtly, much more subtle way into the Jewish community, try to persuade even people who didn't even want to hear Paul's name, but people who could somehow more knowledge about rabbinic literature to say, oh yes, you're right, actually we have this kind of display of the Jewish law. So I might follow your implication. The core is the soul, so the Ten Commandments are the soul, the rest is the body, which is a Pauline, but it's not Paul. So there is no overt quotation from Paul.
Because the argumentation the motivation is very similar to use it by Paul, so that's why I.
Okay.
All this theology of liberation deal with the problem of the violence. The violence in this theology, it's anti-Christian charity.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I can just ask quickly. Eitan, you described the story as a Latin American story, but my understanding was liberation theology starts in Western Europe in the 30s, and that there's a strong element of a Catholic left in the 30s in Belgium and in France, and that many of them are also part of this Catholic left, then go into the Vatican II. So how much of this is as a dual Western European Latin American story, or does that Catholic left leave and it becomes uniquely Latin American?
No, the influence was ever because Gutierrez and Camilo Torres, who also wrote theology before he died, studied in Louvain in Belgium. Gutierrez studied theology and Camilo Torres studies sociology in Louvain. They were very influenced by the European movements there, European political movements, social democratic or socialist movement, Christian socialist movements in Europe, in Belgium, in France, yes, of course, in Algeria, yes, of course. But until the 60s, until Gutierrez, nobody wrote theology. The problem was how to theologize these currents in Christianity. And the first who did the job, or took the challenge, was Gutierrez. From then on, we have many different theologies of liberation, of women, of races, of colored, etc., etc. But he was the first. He was the pioneer. Before there were movements, yes, but no theologies.
We're going to close the debate. Okay, the session is over. Thanks to all.